Thank you very much, and I'll try to be precise because I'm the only item between you and lunch. And I'd like to talk about something different a little bit, about the long-term health conditions in Israeli Holocaust survivors and their offspring, at least present whatever we know about it. So I'll start with a very short introduction, then I'll talk about the long-term health conditions in general and in a very specific group of those born during the Holocaust. And then I'll talk briefly about the second generation, briefly because there isn't much information about it, and I'll conclude. So just to start, we had over 3 million immigrants arriving in Israel in between 1948 and 2010, and 2/3 of them were from Europe, or at least of European origin. So they could have come also from America, but they were of European origin. And also some of them arrived before the war in the illegal immigration to Israel, Aliyah Bet. But currently, we only have around, these are the estimates, around 170,000 Holocaust survivors in Israel, and most of them were actually child survivors because of the time gap, of course. And often I'm asked why research on Holocaust survivors in Israel started that late. So in fact, at the beginning, when Israel was established, almost no research was done. Israel was a nation struggling for its existence. But the Eichmann trial in 1961 actually increased awareness, and research started around then, but it mostly focused on acute morbidity and also on mental health mostly, and not really much of physical health. Only the realization in the 1990s that there could also be long-term impact of the Holocaust atrocities or early age famine exposure that was actually reported, mostly from studies on non-Jewish populations, such as the Dutch hunger winter and the Leningrad siege. Only then it was actually realized that the Holocaust survivors in Israel may also have long-term impact, long-term effects that should be considered. And actually, this is where I start, because I'd like to talk about that. So for years, there was an observation in the Israel Cancer Registry, National Cancer Registry, which is a good one, established in 1960 and with very high validity. And it was shown, it was actually seen that those that of European origin, and this is the green lines here, have higher cancer rates than other Jewish origins. And the question was whether many of them being Holocaust survivors has to do with it. So the Holocaust included many exposures that we now know may actually contribute to cancer susceptibility later in life, such as exposure to famine, and this was already talked about, and to the elements and the horrendous sanitation conditions, infectious morbidity, even occupational carcinogens in those that were forced to work for the Reich, and also long-standing mental and physical stress, which is now also recognized as a potential reason for later morbidity. And in studies done regarding cancer in non-Jewish population, it was reported, although it was controversial, it was reported that there might be a higher risk for cancer, breast cancer in the Netherlands, and also supported by findings of the British Channel Islands and the siege on Leningrad. So there were several studies done in Israel on this subject, starting only in the 1990s and later, as I said. And the first of them was published in 2009 in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, and it looks at actually all Israelis of European origin in Israel up to a certain time point, and we considered those those immigrating to Israel before World War II as non-exposed, and those immigrating to Israel after World War II as exposed. So it was an ecological study, but on a national basis. And we looked at cancer incidence by birth cohorts. And what we found was that there was a higher risk, significantly higher risk for cancer, all-site cancer in all birth cohorts. But more importantly, there was an inverse association between age at exposure, that is age of being born and being exposed to the Holocaust, and cancer risk. So the lower the age, the higher the risk. And we found that also for specific cancers. We found it also for female breast cancer. We found it also for colorectal cancer, including this age gradient. And we also found it for lung cancer, but without the age gradient. We also had supporting evidence accumulated throughout the years since then. So in 2014, there was a study that showed that all-site cancer prevalence was higher in Holocaust survivors compared to Israel-born counterparts. In 2016, we published another study, a cohort study on men that were aged between 28 and 40 at World War II, and we were able in this study to adjust for known risk factors for cancer, such as smoking, such as physical inactivity, such as socioeconomic status. And we also showed that they had higher risk for cancer. And after we also adjusted it for competing risks, it was exactly the same risk as was found in our Journal of National Cancer Institute study for the oldest birth cohort. There was also another study which is about to be published now, done by Professor Sadetsky, which looked again on a national basis at Holocaust survivors in Israel. The exposure was assessed also by ecological proxy, but also by personal reports. And they also found that there was a higher risk for cancer in Holocaust survivors. And they also found it for colorectal cancer and also for lung cancer, but not for breast cancer. And I mention that because based on this study, the Israeli government decided to compensate Holocaust survivors in Israel for colorectal cancer and for lung cancer, but not for breast cancer. And we did show in another case control study that we had, done on 65 breast cancer patients and 200 controls that were all Holocaust survivors, all born in Europe, all lived under Nazi regime for at least 6 months. We were able to show that those that suffered more extreme famine were at a 4-fold higher risk for breast cancer. So I think this is quite established, and this is something that perhaps the government should correct. We also found in this study that World War II related PTSD may modify this association, that is, may act synergistically with a famine exposure to increase the risk for breast cancer. But there are also other chronic conditions that, were reported in studies on non-Jewish populations that are higher in those exposed to famine early in their childhood, such as obesity, dyslipidemia, diabetes, hypertension, metabolic syndrome, which includes the all 4 that I just mentioned, cardiovascular diseases, asthma, schizophrenia, and even shorter lifespan. So in Israel, we had a little bit more studies done on this. It started in the 80s. Professor Ori is part of some of them. And you can see here the list of them. And I tried to summarize the findings. And what was found in these studies was that hypertension apparently had no association with being in the Holocaust. But gastrointestinal symptoms were higher in those that were Holocaust survivors, as well as chronic pain, as well as osteoporosis in women, and as well as physical health in general and schizophrenia. And all of these findings were actually in accordance with what was reported for non-Jewish populations. However, lifespan in Holocaust survivors living in Israel was apparently longer than that of their counterparts, and this is against what was previously published for non-Jewish populations. But Professor Shasha and myself and our team was interested in child survivors, those that were born in 1940 to 1945. And why? Because of the thought of epigenetics, because we were thinking that those that were born during the Holocaust, their mothers during their pregnancies were apparently also exposed to very severe conditions. And epigenetics is basically meaning the plasticity of our genome, that is, the possibility of the genome to show different phenotypes, as different as a caterpillar, a cocoon, and a butterfly, just by differential expression of genes and not by changing the DNA itself, not by mutations, but by differential gene expression. And it was already shown by Barker's theory and later on other expansions of this theory that prenatal factors such as maternal nutrition, maternal feminine for this, in our case, and also childhood factors may later on lead to a certain expression of genes that put the adult more susceptible to risk factors such as obesity and metabolic syndrome, and later on, probably as a consequence of that, at a higher susceptibility for chronic diseases such as cardiovascular diseases and diabetes. And what's more, these changes, these epigenetic changes, are actually quantifiable. So it can be quantified by the methylation of certain genes or acetylation of histones that are covering the DNA. And that actually led way for a certain type of research now looking at epigenetics. And for example, from the Dutch hunger winter, we know that men that were exposed to the Dutch hunger winter at adolescence or early adulthood, they showed certain epigenetic changes that were associated with higher risk for colorectal cancer much later in life. And there are also other studies like this. For example, this one here that showed that exposure to diethyl sylbestrol or bisphenol A in rats or mice, is it? I don't remember, anyway, caused certain epigenetic changes that may have later led to higher risk for breast cancer. And they also showed these changes in an in vitro study that went along with this one. And this one here that showed that certain epigenetic changes in the brain, again, of laboratory animals, could have explained perhaps the higher risk for schizophrenia shown in the survivors. So we looked at cancer in these child survivors, those that were born during the Holocaust. And I already showed you our study of the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, and this was the youngest birth cohort, and they had the highest risk for cancer. And it was, of course, statistically significant. As for other chronic diseases, we conducted 2 cross-sectional studies. One of them was a pilot study. And in this study, we did have a face-to-face interview with the exposed, and we did validate the exposures so that we were sure that their mothers were pregnant during the Holocaust. But the outcomes were reported, and we didn't have a control group, so we compared the results to the general population in Israel, to the prevalence in the general population in Israel. The second one was based on HMO, a Health Maintenance Organization study on the Clalit HMO in Israel, which is the largest. We looked at the Northern District, and we did use an exposure proxy, which was based on the year of birth, the place of birth, and the immigration to Israel date. But the outcomes were highly validated through this database of the HMO. And the controls were also drawn from this database. I know that there was another HMO-based study like this one, also looking at the child survivors born in 1940 to 45. This was done in the Maccabi HMO by Professor Ash. And unfortunately, the results are not published, but I can tell you that they were very supportive of ours. And this is more or less what we found. Obesity was much more prevalent in Holocaust, in those born during the Holocaust than their controls. as well as dyslipidemia, as well as hypertension, as well as diabetes. All of them actually make the metabolic syndrome, so no surprise that this was also more prevalent. And cardiovascular diseases and chronic lung disease and chronic pain, peptic ulcer disease, renal failure, as well as cancer and depression and anxiety. The only thing we couldn't find higher prevalence in those born during the Holocaust was osteoporosis, which may say something about the relevant time window of exposure to this specific outcome. It may be that the lower age that they were exposed in was not relevant to osteoporosis. However, it was relevant to many other metabolic outcomes. So what about the second generation? So first of all, why would I think that the second generation be also at higher risk for certain outcomes? Because of the epigenetic theory. And the transgenerational effect it may have. And we do have some studies now showing that there is a transgenerational effect of epigenetic changes, such as the study of Rachel Yehuda, which showed that in second-generation subjects who had one or two parents with a PTSD, they also showed different methylation pattern at certain DNA loci than second-generation subjects that their parents did not suffer PTSD. And it was also shown for lab animals. So there is some grounds to believe that the second generation may also be affected. But other hypotheses also include environmental reasoning. That is, growing up with parents that are Holocaust survivors may impact you in many ways, and not necessarily epigenetically or genetically, but just environmentally. Or even personal background, that is acquiring risk factors for chronic morbidity. I mentioned here smoking, obesity, metabolic syndrome. And the smoking has two question marks because this was checked, and apparently it's not that. So this is not really different between the second generation of Holocaust survivors and controls. There were several studies done in Israel regarding the second generation, and they referred to different populations, and the age was around the late 40s, beginning of the 50s, maybe mid-50s, this last one here, with sometimes very small population, study population, sometimes a little bit larger. And the methodology was different, but still they were able to find higher likelihood of poorer self-perceived mental and physical health and higher prevalence of chronic pain, higher intake of medications in general and particularly psychotropic medications, higher prevalence of having two or more components of the metabolic syndrome. And although one study did not show any of these findings, it was the smallest of them all. So I think there is room for more studies now in the second generation. What we plan for the very near future, we are already starting to prepare for that, is to conduct a population-based study on offspring that were born in 1960 to 1990 of these child survivors, because I think this is a very unique population on the theme of between the first and the second generation. And to link it with national disease registries that we have in Israel, also with the Maccabi database, because we have collaboration of Maccabi for that, and also to study potential epigenetic changes so that we can establish this reasoning. And we'd also like it to be a setting, perhaps, for future studies on the third generation. That's, of course, too early, but it's good to prepare. So to conclude, if we're talking about the first generation, we found higher risk for cancer for all sites, for certain specific sites, and we also think that age at exposure is important. So the younger the age, the higher the risk. We also found higher risk for other chronic conditions, mostly associated with a metabolic syndrome and, of course, its consequences. And we found that the unique population of those born during the Holocaust, they show similar findings, and therefore we advise these populations, the general Holocaust survivors, but also those born during the Holocaust, to be more aware of this fact. And before I call anybody or anybody to do something official, I would like them to know that they should take good care of themselves, them and their caregivers, and to know that they may be at a higher risk for chronic diseases and therefore should do screening tests and whatever is needed. But also the second generation may be at a higher risk. They seem to be at a higher risk. And I think we should now direct our research into this group and also give a thought about the third generation. Thank you.